That being said, I've been really excited for this lecture, all right, because I love oral history, I love stories, and we have an oral history collector with us here today, Michelle Little. So, Michelle Little is an oral historian living in Birmingham, Alabama. She has been interviewing Alabama natives for almost a decade and is passionate about preserving local stories. Much of her interview work can be found at Samford University, where she most recently partnered with students and alumni on oral history projects in celebration of the university's 175th anniversary. She designed and directed large-scale interview projects and developed methods to incorporate oral history and podcasts in the classroom. Her current projects include a StoryCorps collaboration with WBHM that aims to facilitate conversations between people on opposite sides of the political spectrum. She holds a bachelor's in history from Samford University and a master's in theological studies from Beeson Divinity School. She is a member of the Emerging Professionals Committee of the Oral History Association. Michelle is married to Terry, and they have a Jack Russell Molly, who when she is not researching and interviewing, Michelle enjoys trying out recent additions to the Birmingham food scene and is always on hunt for the best latte. So please welcome Michelle Little.
So today I want to give you a broad overview of what oral history is exactly and why we should care about it. And then second, I want to talk about our ethical standards as oral historians and best practices when you're going out and collecting interviews. And then third, I want to just give you some basics as far as audio equipment and collecting audio. So I'm going to cover a lot today, but I want you to be able to leave here and actually go collect interviews. So I'm going to throw a lot of information at you, and feel free to ask questions throughout my talk, and then I'm going to leave plenty of time at the end for questions as well. So when we say oral history, what exactly are we talking about? It's essentially interviewing people, but it's a little bit different from journalistic style interviewing that most people are familiar with. So oral history is collecting life stories. It's long-form storytelling without a set objective or angle in mind on the part of the interviewer. It's creating a new primary resource. So I know you all may be familiar in history classes in college when you write a paper and you always had to have one or two primary resources. So someone that was there, that saw it. And so when you collect an oral history interview, you're creating a new source that you can put in a library, and that's a new source that future researchers can access. So it's a very unique way to collect stories. I named my oral history business Acousite. Acousite is a Greek word that means hear, listen, and learn. So, side note, I'm a little bit of a nerd that took a few semesters of Greek in graduate school, and I geek out about it every now and then. So, hearing, listening, and learning. These are three things we don't always connect in our day-to-day life. And so, when I heard this vocabulary word my first semester in Greek, I asked my professor, I said, what's the deal with this? We've got this one word, it has three different meanings in my mind. And he said, well, think of it this way. If I ask my son to take out the trash, and then I say, son, did you hear me? He's not asking his son if he actually heard the words that came out of his mouth. He's asking his son if he heard him and listened and is changing his course of action now. So it's not a passive listening. When you're doing oral history interview, it's a very intent way of listening and internalizing the information. And it's collecting stories that may otherwise be lost to time. And so it's very important to collect as many voices from a point in time as we can, because we all know there are lots of voices throughout history that have not been collected, just everyday people. And so since we have audio equipment that's accessible to everyone, why not take advantage of this now? And part of the value of the work of oral history is that it helps place a lot of people's perspectives and experiences within a larger social and historical context. And what so often bores students about history is they think it's just memorizing names and dates and that it's just dry facts. But the reality is history is the lived experience. And And so oral history helps fill in the gaps in history. It helps add voices to the record. And there's a lot of narratives and stories out there that only you have access to. There's people that you know that I don't know, that other researchers don't know. So think about your family members, your close friends, people in your church, people in your community that are in your circles that you have unique access to. And so seeking out those stories can give you inspiration in your writing, but then it has the added bonus of creating this new primary resource. And I also think it's a really unique way of establishing character through storytelling. Because the way a person tells a story, the way they remember that story, tells you just as much about that person as the story. So it works on a lot of different levels, and I think it's a great tool for writers. So let's talk about the ethics of doing this for a little bit, because it's a weighty endeavor to go in and collect someone's story and collect their voice, and that should be handled with a lot of care. It's do unto others as you would have done to you is really the best way to think about it throughout the whole process, is to always consider your narrator. And so ethical standards and planning the project really go hand in hand. And your best go-to resource for ethical standards is the Oral History Association. And they've been around since 1966. They are the leading organization for everyone in the U.S. and internationally that is doing this kind of work. And they set our ethical standards and best practices. They review them every year. So if you're really considering doing some of this interviewing, I would definitely recommend to go to their website. It's just oralhistory.com. So they got the domain name early. And they also have an annual conference every year in the fall. And it's a fantastic gathering of people from all different professions that use oral history work: writers, documentarians, professors, independent scholars. We get together every year and think about trends in the industry and issues we're encountering in our work, so that's another great resource. So in their statement on ethics, the way we think about it is the entire process of oral history, we think of it as a web of mutual responsibility. So everyone that's involved in the process, from the interviewers and the narrators to archivists to people 20 years from now that are accessing the interviews and are going to use them in their research and writing, we're all part of this web of mutual responsibility that are working to ensure that the narrator's perspective, dignity, and privacy are respected, since they're giving of their story and their voice. So one way to ensure you're treating your narrator fairly is to plan the beginning to end process and make sure that works for everyone involved. And so thinking through that process should include at least these 4 things. And again, this is the very tip of the iceberg of ethics. Informed consent, so a release form that states who has access to the interview. I'm looking at Salem because we just did a StoryCorps interview with Salem, and so she's very familiar with the release forms that StoryCorps has put together. But it details who has the copyright, who can use it in the future, which ways it will be used, if it's going to be on the internet, if it's going to just be in an archive, lay everything out there. Second, your goal and purpose of the project. So what is it that you're setting out to do? Are you researching your family's history, compiling stories about your neighborhood or your community? Are you documenting your church history? Just plan it all out. How many narrators are you going to involve? And then what's your timeline? Of course, this is going to depend on how many narrators. And then finally, think about your archiving plan. So all of that is part of your goal. Think of it as if you were writing a grant application. You would have to state exactly what you're planning to do, who's involved, how you're going to get it done. And then the third part of the ethics is your review process. So one thing that sets oral history apart is we allow our narrators to review the transcript. So that's different from journalism, but we transcribe, we give them a copy. If they want a portion redacted, we edit. So make sure you allow time for your narrators to look through their transcript. And then finally, when you're planning everything out, is to do your research on whatever, if it's your neighborhood, if it's your church, do enough background research and to prepare for the interviews. And really that's just good manners for your narrators not to waste their time and to know what questions to ask. So those are just 4 basic things that you need to think through when you're trying to make sure you're conducting your interviews ethically. I want to spend the most time on best practices because this is going to take you through step by step what you'll need to do to actually conduct an interview next week if you want to do it. Okay, so once you've decided how many narrators, who your narrators are, go ahead and meet with them before you actually sit down to do the interview, especially if you've never talked to them before. If you're just emailing them for the first time, and if you can't meet with them in person, at least talk to them on the phone to get a sense of how they talk, establish a little bit of trust if you've never met them before and you're coming to do an oral history interview. And if you're walking in the door and then you're about to sit down in 30 minutes and start asking some fairly personal questions, it's good to establish a little bit of trust with that person. So try to meet them ahead of time and plan out where you're going to do the interview. And you definitely want to take into account background noise when you're planning out your spot. Like a coffee shop would be a terrible idea. But if you could meet in a study room at the library even, you can usually get those without having to pay any money. And then when you're starting to do your research for your interview, and then you start to structure your interview questions. And I usually recommend to students to either just come in with 5 questions that they want to ask, or just a basic outline of what they want to cover in the interview. Because you don't want to just be tempted to go down your list of questions. If you have 20 questions in front of you, you're not going to be forced to listen to what the other person is saying and come up with follow-up questions. So I really like to just have an outline of topics I want to cover. And then that way you're just zoned in on that person and what they're saying and how they're feeling. And I like to do, since I do life history interviews, I start out very broad in my questioning. So I ask background information, where did the person grow up? Tell me about your parents. You'll just be surprised, even if you're thinking about a specific topic, like you're researching this church or this neighborhood, and you think you're only wanting to ask about that, you'd be so surprised what in that person's background led them to that point in their life, to that church, to that community, to that neighborhood. So always, I start out very broad and get as much background information as I can. Plus, people know the answers to these things, so it's easy for them. They may be a little nervous as well, and so it's easy to start out, well, tell me about where you grew up. They know that. They know the answer. And then you can narrow it down into, a specific point in time. Food is also a very good trigger for stories, so especially if you're doing a family interview. Food often triggers a lot of memories, about the person making the food, about holiday traditions. So that's another good way to start out the interview, particularly with family members, is maybe talking through a recipe, or if you want to set up some family interviews, around a meal. That's just another fun thing to do. And then always ask your questions in a way that's not going to elicit just a yes or no response. You want to get the person talking as much as possible, and so when you listen back to the recording, you really just want to hear yourself saying a few questions, but you just want to have them these long periods of talking. And so, what was that like? Tell me more about that. It's kind of like being a good date, you know, like just be nice and considerate and ask them about themselves. And then, of course, don't layer your questions with any judgment. You know, you wouldn't want to say, well, that must have been a terrible place to grow up, or that must have been a horrible experience. Don't layer any judgment into the way you're asking your questions. And then test your equipment ahead of time, and we'll go over some equipment options at the end, but you'll be a little nervous when you get there, they'll be a little nervous, and so you want to, the night before, the day before, go through your equipment, make sure you've got enough battery power, make sure you've got backup batteries, make sure your SD card actually has enough space on it, or your phone if you're using your phone. So just run through all that ahead of time, and factor in time to set up your equipment when you actually get to the interview. That's going to take you some time too. Release forms. So, and there's two different forms I like to include. There's of course the release form, which I recommend you do at the end of the interview, because the person then knows everything they've said, and then they know what they're actually signing a release for. And we also do a narrator's life history form, and this is a great thing to take with the interview to the archive, and it gets a little more background information on the person, correct spellings of names, their parents' names, date of birth, and I like to have them do that at the beginning of the interview. It gives them something to work on while I'm setting up my equipment, and I'll give you some resources on where to find a sample of all those forms. But it's a great thing to place with the audio in the archive to give a little more context on the person. And then at the beginning of the interview, you want to slate the tape. You want to say who you are, who you're interviewing, the date, where you are. That way, if somehow that audio ever gets lost from its paperwork, that you'll actually be able to listen to it and know who's on the tape. I can't tell you how many archived cassette tapes or reel-to-reel tapes we found in libraries, and they didn't slate the tape, and so you just listen and listen for hours, and you try to figure out who's talking. So we can prevent this. Just slate the tape. Slate the tape. And then after the interview, this is like extra credit here, but oral historians, we do something called field notes. And so right after the interview, I go to a coffee shop or whatever's close by, and I write out just all my impressions of how the interview went, how everybody was feeling, what any kind of extra information that you're not going to get from the recording, but that may help the researcher to know. Like a good example of this, a few years back, I interviewed a woman, and a part of a tree had fallen on her house that morning, and the house was still structurally sound. And we'd had some hard time scheduling the interview, so we went ahead and did the interview that day. But because she was dealing with this, somewhat of a crisis, she wasn't quite herself, So it's just helpful for a researcher a few years down the road to know, okay, well, this may have changed the way she answered some questions that day. So field notes, again, extra credit, but I highly recommend it, and your librarian will thank you. And we all like to keep librarians happy. And then the next thing you want to do right after the interview is upload the audio. So whatever equipment you're using, I like to get it off of that audio recorder as quick as possible, because if something happens to that piece of equipment, it's just gone, and you've done all this work. So I keep it in three different places if you can. I keep it on an external hard drive, I keep it on a cloud-based storage system, and then I keep another backup on my computer or a server if you have access to that. And then I always send a thank you note to the person. They have given, your narrator has given you their time, they've shared their stories with you, and so I always send a handwritten thank you note to anyone that takes time to sit down with me to do this. And then the next part of best practices is transcription. Now, not everybody can do this. It's time consuming, And there are some oral history programs that don't transcribe. StoryCorps does not transcribe. So, if everybody knows that ahead of time and they're okay with that, that's fine. But we really recommend transcribing, especially if you're planning to put any of your audio on the internet, on a website. With ADA regulations now, you have to have a typed out copy. You have to have a transcription of audio that you're putting on a website. A lot of universities are getting targeted for that kind of thing right now. So, if you have your own website, I don't think anyone's going to come after you, but it's just good practices to have a transcription. And so there's a few different options for this, and automatic transcription software is getting better. It's not quite there right now. I really think in the next 7 years, someone's going to figure it out. I don't know why 7. I just feel like that's when it's going to happen.
It's the magic number.
It's the magic number. Maybe Amazon will figure it out. I don't know. But there's a service called Trint, Trint, and a lot of journalists use this. It'll let you type in accents and it'll try to account for accents. And so you upload the audio. It does cost $15 per hour of audio, but it will spit out a transcription in about 10 minutes.
What?
Yes. Now you do have to go back in and you have to do a good bit of repair work to it. But it's a start. It really helps. And when I'm doing just journalistic style interviews, and those are just 20 minutes, it's perfect. It's perfect. But when you're dealing with, yes.
What was the name of it?
It's Trint, Trint.
Not print.
Not print, yeah. T is in Tom.
Man, I've been doing it the hard way.
Yeah. But it's there's good and bad, because if you have a narrator that has any kind of accent, you're going to have to do a good. And in the South, a lot of us have accents, so there's going to be some repair work. But it's a good option right now. If you don't want to go that route, there's another software that's free. This is not automatic, but it will help you. It's called InkScribe. Now this is a weird spelling. It's INQSCRIBE. And this will allow you to upload the audio, and then it has a platform. It'll slow down the audio to half speed or less than half speed, and that way you can continue typing rather than stopping and starting and stopping and starting. Mm-hmm. Or if you have the old foot pedals, so InkScribe is a great option too. Now, if you have grant funding, if you're just independently wealthy, there's an audio transcription center out of Boston, and I love them. And when I do have grant funding, I use them. Now, they will charge $150 per hour of audio, and they'll turn it around in about a day or 2 days, and they are professional. They are top-notch. So if you have grant funding, use it on the transcription.
What's the name of that place?
It's Audio Transcription Center, and they're in Boston. And so once you've got the transcription done, you've done all the hard work, then you send this back to your narrator and give them, I usually give them, between 2 weeks to a month if you have it, but usually they'll sit down and do this in a couple of weeks. I do like to let people know ahead of time, the point is for the audio to match the transcript as closely as possible. And so sometimes when people get back a verbatim transcript of what they sound like, they're a little upset, because we do not speak imperfect, pretty sentences, and we say like and we stutter every now and then. And so people are a little surprised when they see that. And so I like to tell people up front, this is a good thing to go over in your initial coffee meeting, that it's verbatim, and that's part of the point. It's part of the beauty is that we're trying to capture the way in which people talk at a certain point in place in time in history. And we want records of how people talk. We want authentic records of this. And so just if you prepare people ahead of time, they usually understand. And you can't, what I do offer to edit, of course, is I hey, I wish I had not told this story about Bob. Can you take out this whole story? Yeah, I mean, yes, you can edit that kind of audio edit, but to go in and take out all the ums and stops, you don't want to get into that kind of editing. So let them do their edits, and then you do what you can to correct that. And then you're done. Then you can send it to an archive, you can publish it on a website, whatever you've agreed to in your proposal and your outline. And so that's your full process of best practices. So I'm going to talk a little bit about equipment. Do y'all have any questions about practices before I go over some equipment options? And there's going to be plenty of time at the end for questions as well. Okay. Yes,
Do you
Sam?
feel that some people are a little intimidated? They say, I don't want to be recorded, or they don't?
A lot of people are, they think, so I encounter two things. Some people think, well, what do I have to contribute? They think, well, I don't really have anything important to say. I haven't done anything important. But everyone's life is so unique and full of stories. And so it's usually that's, you may have to talk to them a little bit about why you want to do this. And then some people are a little intimidated by the microphones or the equipment at first, but usually after a couple of minutes, they kind of get used to it and realize this is just a conversation. There happens to be equipment here, but I'm not an intimidating person.
So then you have to get permission to print it.
So that's part of the release form, and that's also part of that initial informed consent. When I approach people about an interview, I explain, this is a project for the Southern Foodways Alliance. They're going to put this on their website, or this is a project for StoryCorps, and parts of this interview can be clipped together for radio. So from the get-go, it's clear what the end result will be. Yeah. And sometimes people are, just say no. I'd rather not do that. But most times they're excited to take part in it. Okay, so equipment can be a little overwhelming. There's a lot of options out there now, but I always tell people just use what you're comfortable with and what you have the budget for. And half of the battle is really controlling for background noise. So as long as you find a quiet space with some carpet is great, so that it's not echoey, then you're combating a lot of common issues. So you can absolutely use your phone. I mean, if you just don't know, especially if you're not sure you really want to do a lot of this, I wouldn't go out and invest in a fancy recorder. The phone will do fine. Make sure you have enough space on your phone, though, before you set out to do an hour interview. Make sure you've cleared off enough storage space on your phone. And there's plenty of voice recording apps, yes.
How much storage space is to be expected? How many gigs?
So, I would make sure, phones are at least 16 gigs now. I would make sure you have at least a gig open. Now, if your phone will only record an MP3, it's going to take up less space. You really want to record in WAV. If you think of the sound waves are like this, WAV files capture, about this much of a sound wave. MP3 recording is only capturing about this much. And WAV is the archival quality that is expected for recording. So that's part of the reason you do want to try to get a field recorder or something, is to make sure you can record in WAV rather than MP3. But if you've only got something that'll record in MP3, that's fine. It's better than not doing this. But one of my recent projects, I'd say, was 25. Well, the StoryCorps project was 25 or 26, about an hour on each interview, and that's taking between 15 and 20 gigabytes of space. So just when you're looking at storage options. But on phones, if you want to record on your phone, there's plenty of voice memo apps out there. There's one called Rev, R-E-V, and it even has a transcription plug-in. You know, you can pay a little extra and it'll do the transcription right there in the app. So that's a good option. Or if you want to use the phone and you want to spring for an external microphone, that will help a ton to have a little external microphone with your phone. And then if you do want to spend a little bit of money, I mean, there's plenty of recorders out there. I've always used Zooms, and this little guy's an H1. It's got 2 microphones on it. You can plug in an external mic, and you can pick this guy up for under $100 on Amazon. So that's an H1. The Zooms go up for their H2 is going to run you about $250. It's got 5 microphones on it, and but they're all very user friendly. I mean, once you get the settings, it's just you hit record and you're going. There's not a recording mode and then a record. You know, I rarely have students that mess up with Zooms. These are great field recorders, and they go up and up. I mean, I've got an H6. You know, they just go up in numbers. But really consider getting an external microphone if you can. And then the other reason to look into a field recorder is you can adjust the gain level of the mic. So if someone is a very loud speaker, you can turn down the mic gain. If they're very soft, you can turn up the mic gain. So that's just one of the kind of gadgety things that you look for in a field recorder. But again, just try to find something that can record in WAV. And then we were just talking about storage, but when you're thinking for your equipment, storage is definitely another consideration that can cost you money if you don't have enough on your computer. Just look into a nice external drive or a cloud-based server. But I try to keep everything from one project on one external drive. So at my house, I've got like 20 external drives with different projects. But this can get, if you're doing 20 to 30 interviews on a project, just being organized from the beginning. I can't stress that enough. And having a filing system for your audio and not getting audio mixed up is just, it's really something to consider. And then your editing software, finally, if you're going to hopefully allow your narrators to edit, and since you want the audio to match the transcription, then you'll want to learn a little bit about audio editing, which you can totally do. It's not that hard. It's really just like cutting and pasting out of a Word document. You can definitely learn how to do this, especially if you're just wanting to clip off, 2 minutes here, 2 minutes there. There are a couple of free audio editing software. Of course, there's GarageBand, and then there's one called Audacity. That's another good free one. And if you want to pay a little bit, Adobe Audition is my favorite. And that's like a monthly subscription type thing. So those are the 3 main techie kind of things. So there's a lot to doing oral history, but it's fun to figure it all out, I promise. And so I want to, for this last part, I just want to leave you with some additional resources you can look at, and then we'll have time for questions. So, of course, the Oral History Association website I've mentioned is going to be a great resource for finding forms, like release forms, narrator forms, and then ethical standards and best practices. They have a whole suite of documents on their website that walk you through every type of situation you could think about. The StoryCorps website is another good resource. First of all, they've got great clips of interviews. They animate their interviews, some of them, and they have resource kits on there. They also have an app, the StoryCorps app, and that will take you through doing the whole interview. It'll give you sample questions, and they even have a way for you to do their release form, and so it will archive it. If you sign the releases, it will archive it in the Library of Congress with all the StoryCorps interviews. So if you just want to try one out and have it's all there ready-made, ready to go, that's a great little introduction to doing interviews. A lot of students use that. The one argument we do have with StoryCorps is they don't transcribe. You will get a copy of your audio, so they'll send you a copy of the audio. But I mean, it's a fantastic app. Oral History in the Digital Age is another good resource for you, because oral historians have had to deal with a good bit of changes in the digital age, both with what can be done with interviews now as far as putting them online, matching them with transcriptions, and then also with our actual methods, with the equipment that's out there, and video. A lot of people are wanting to do video now. So Oral History in the Digital Age is a good one. The Library of Congress Folk Life Center, I think, is probably the best resource for the release forms that they use, and then their narrator forms. They have a lot of good ones on there as well. And then the last two I would recommend, Baylor University has one of the largest oral history programs in the U.S. They are top-notch, and they have an excellent transcription guide. So if you start doing your transcriptions, and when you're doing verbatim transcriptions, you're going to come across crazy questions you never thought. It's just crazy how people actually talk, and you're trying to figure out how to type it, and of course it doesn't match anything you've ever learned in an English class. So their transcription guide is very helpful. And then the Southern Foodways Alliance is the last website I'll tell you about, and they're based in Mississippi. They commission oral history work all throughout the Southeast, and I think it's a great place to get inspiration on interviews. They have a podcast called Gravy, and then a journal that comes out called Gravy, and so that's another place. And to look at their interview, they have their full transcripts online. Yes.
Can you repeat that name?
The Southern Foodways Alliance. Mm-hmm. All right, well, I wanted to leave plenty, so we've got some time if anybody has questions about anything related to oral history.
So how do you come across your narrators?
So, yeah, it depends on the project. So with this, I'm doing a project for the Southern Foodways Alliance that I just started last week, and it's looking at 5 different faith communities in Alabama and their foodways. And so one of them is the Greek Food Festival, Holy Trinity, Holy Cross, the Lebanese Food Festival. And so I usually I meet someone in that community that can help direct me, that knows more people in that community. And then I go on to a few services and try to connect with a few more people, and then try to identify people that have been involved with the food festival, that don't seem too shy, that do want to talk with me. So that's kind of how I'm picking narrators for that project. The StoryCorps project I just did with WBHM, that one I was lucky enough that they advertised for that, and people applied. I mean, over 200 people applied to be part of that project, which was amazing. But most of my projects have been a good bit smaller, and it's just people I've met in the community. We did a project in Rosedale, and so once you know one person in that community, you can spread out from there and meet other people. It just depends on do you have like a specific project in mind, or you're just...
I was wondering how you would connect with people in like all these different communities for varying levels of projects.
Yeah, I would think first about communities that you're entrenched in, places and people that that just kind of seem interesting, and you wonder about their stories. And
do you ever have people come up to you and like just want their own personal history recorded?
We've had a few. It's usually people that want their they want their parents' histories recorded. I don't know if I've had anyone that just wanted their personal, but a lot of folks, when their parents start getting a little bit older, they think we should record some of some of this. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
So when you're doing your interviews, are you actually able to set to the certain amount of time you set aside to do it? Because when people start talking, a lot of times it just keeps going,
Oh, yeah.
Like, I'm working on a cookbook for a family, and they want these personal stories involved in it. And so I say, okay, so we're gonna meet for an hour and a half, but I actually allow for 3 hours, because I know they're not gonna stop. Because a lot of times after they've opened up, after it's been a little time, they open up a little more, a couple little cocktails have happened. So, you found that to be a problem? Well, it's okay.
I think the cocktails are part of it. I usually wait till after the interview for the cocktails. But yes, I do, I tell people usually an hour to 2 hours, and I just, if they want to talk for 2 hours, I am there, I just try to be as flexible as you can. I mean, we've all, at some point, you got to go home and cook dinner, but it can go for a while, which is great. I mean, I love it when my narrators are just rolling. Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know if that was just with certain people, or I'm sure that happens kind of across the board.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good problem to have. Yeah.
Is there any monetary compensation? I'm not clear if this is a business or a hobby or.
Oh yes, no. This is now. I used to run the oral history program at Sanford, and so we had students, and we would do projects out in the community. And since Sanford was paying me then, well, that was one thing. But no, now I and a lot of my oral history component, we do this as a business, yeah. So with family interviews, and I have a website that explains all the different packages, but a lot of my work is through grant funding, so I'll partner with professors at different universities, and we apply for grants through the Alabama Humanities Foundation, or the Southern Foodways Alliance is commissioning me to do this project here in Birmingham. So most of the time it's through larger organizations that we can partner and get grant funding for this. So yeah, it's very unstable.
Frankly. So is there a marketing component here?
Yeah.
The food festival.
Oh, for the food. Oh, do you mean for the organization?
Yeah, if somebody wants to market their restaurant or I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that would be up to the, I see what you're saying. Like, someone could do interviews for a company, and then if they want to use it to market, yes, they can do that. Yeah. They are able to use the material in whichever way they would like to. Yeah.
So you mentioned partnering with professors. Do they approach you, or do you approach them? Do you say, oh, I think it would be fun to do something on the history of medicine, and there are professors that teach that, and you come to them? I mean, how does that work?
Recently, some people have approached me. I mean, when I was first starting the program at Sanford, and there's never, I would have to approach more people then, because it just wasn't on the forefront of people's minds. But this year, I've been very fortunate, and a few people have approached me about partnering on grant projects. So, once people know about it, I think they see it as a valuable tool, and that it's a great and it's wonderful for college students. I mean, I just can't tell you how fantastic it was to put projects into classes. Because it could work in any different kind of class. I mean, everything has a history. And so for students to get out of the classroom and go interview people out in the community about, whatever the topic, from biology to history, it's such a great thing for them to kind of think outside the box and not just sit and listen to lectures. But no, not the lectures are bad. But, yeah.
At Sanford, how would somebody like me get to see oral histories?
Now, yeah.
That you did like at Sanford.
Yeah, so there, when I left in June, I handed everything over to Jennifer Taylor in Special Collection, and so they've got all the audio and the paper transcripts, and So they're working on the best way to make that available to the general public. And then there's still, before we left, we were able to put about 30 to 40 of them on the website, and I think they're planning to keep that live as long as they can. So there's some still on the web.
What got you started? What was the little seed that,
Well, it wasn't any kind of great decision or track on my. I used to be a paralegal for about 10 years when I first got out of college, and then when Sanford they were planning their 175th anniversary, one of my old professors was gonna try to put together a history, and so he contacted me and asked if I wanted to come and do the interviews for. I'd done a lot of interviews, I guess, in undergrad. I'd always liked doing that. I used to volunteer in a nursing home when I was in high school, just to sit and listen to the residents talk. So I guess I've just always liked to listen to people. I'm an only child, so I don't know if that explains it. So that's how I ended up at Sanford. And then I was doing a lot of, just over 100 interviews for their history. And then when we kind of got done with that project, I was partnering with a lot of different professors to put projects in the classroom and we did the Rosedale project, we put little podcasts together. So then I started brainstorming about all kinds of projects to do in Birmingham. So, no great plan.
How do you feel about the addition of visual, turning this into a video thing? Does that make it more complicated? And where does the interviewer fit into that? Is the interviewer this disembodied voice that comes across?
Yes, the interviewer is a disembodied voice. I'm still very hesitant with video. I mean, because it is very complicated. I mean, I'm not a trained videographer. I've learned, I took a couple of classes from videography professors at Sanford just to try to, and I can do it, but I think it just adds, it makes it a little more nerve-wracking for your narrator to be on video. And I've worked so hard to make my narrators as comfortable as possible, and so, and some people don't mind it, but I don't like being videoed. There's that barrier, and then the storage of the files. I mean, storing audio is already pretty difficult, but storing video, now that people are shooting in 4K, I mean, they're very large files, so libraries are very hesitant to take in those video files and care for them, so I'd rather not with video, but we'll see what happens in the future. I think just the audio and then having photographs of that person are, to me, just as powerful as the video. So.
Do you have any recommendations for good interview podcasts?
Well, Grady's a great one. Let's see, let me think of, our old little, it was called Sam.wave, our podcast at Sanford that we every semester, whatever our project was, the students put together a podcast.
Which it's great, by the way. I binged all of them once I asked Michelle to come and speak with us. StoryCorps interviews, they have a podcast. But yeah. Yes.
you mentioned photos. Do you take photos or you're asking the narrator to provide or what?
I've done both, but if it's convenient the day of the interview, I do ask to go ahead and snap some photographs. And then depending on the grant project and the organization, like the Southern Foodways Alliance actually sends out a photographer to do, with the StoryCorps project, we snap photographs right after the interview. But it is very helpful to have, to go ahead and get that the day of the interview.
So just with your phone, nothing?
Yeah, I just use my phone. Phones are pretty fancy nowadays.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming to be with us today.